A recurring theme in our political debates is federal spending. America runs high deficits and keeps increasing the national debt. So what will it take to actually get it under control?
In a few years, the money that we pay just to service our debt, the interest, from carrying a large debt, the money that we service it with could potentially be larger than our defense budget. And it will be our largest budget item in 20 or 30 years.
This week, we're giving you a crash course in federal spending, how it's impacting inflation, and what we should expect from our elected officials to better protect the fiscal health of the United States. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we're committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and our topic this week is federal spending, inflation, deficits, the debt, and we sit down once again with Beth Akers, who's a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute and a feature contributor here at Defending Ideas. Beth, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here today.
So we're talking about the concept of defending enterprise as some of your regularly contributed content here.
Right.
And you had a great conversation with Congressman Blake Moore about spending and debt and the deficit. And I want to start off by asking, kind of set the stage for us. Federal spending has been something that elected officials, usually Republicans, but not always, essentially budget hawks, have been concerned about for years, have been warning us that increasing our deficit year after year, increasing our debt, at some point we're really going to start to feel the pain. With the inflation we're feeling, the economic circumstances we're in, are they being vindicated?
It's never been fun to be a fiscal conservative. We're kind of in the position of saying, come on, rein it in, guys, like some bad stuff is coming. Bad stuff meaning inflation or the fact that we eventually have to pay back all these things that we've been paying for that are beyond our means. So yeah, in a way, we are in a moment where the consequences of spending beyond our means is more tangible for most people than ever before. Inflation is a good example. I mean, the inflation that we're experiencing now is a part of a product of the unprecedented crisis we had with COVID. But most people agree that at least part of it is being driven by our historical fiscal policy and where we are in terms of deficit spending and the national debt. So yeah, I guess it's maybe a little more fun to be a fiscal conservative today. It's not always the most fun position to hold.
So you get to say a little bit of, I told you so, runaway spending is going to cause some problems, and those problems are happening now. But it's also a bad problem to have because Americans are feeling these increased prices. We're seeing budget constraints in terms of government spending. It's harder to spend on priorities we actually would want to spend on. How much of this just comes down to political decisions rather than purely economic factors?
Yeah, exactly. Economists can wring our hands all day long about what should be happening. The fact that we should maintain, a reasonable amount of spending relative to the wealth that we're creating in the economy. But, when it comes to it, the decisions are being made by politicians in Washington, D.C., and they're not making decisions necessarily entirely in an economic framework, unfortunately, but rather through the political process that we have in place, which we all know is not necessarily exactly what we think it should be. So yes, I had a fantastic conversation with Congressman Moore that we'll go into next that was really shed some light on how this works.
Well, we're going to take a quick break and then jump right into your conversation with Congressman Moore. This is part of our Defending Enterprise series that Beth is contributing for us here. So when we come back, listeners, stay tuned because you're going to hear some really good insights in terms of some of the politics going on with these spending decisions, as well as some of the economic factors at play. So stay tuned for our Defending Enterprise segment with Beth Akers and her conversation with Congressman Blake Moore. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I am Beth Akers, bringing you the Defending Enterprise segment for today. I'm very pleased to have with me today a very special guest in Congressman Blake Moore. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Beth. Love to be on.
Okay, so you very strongly identify as a fiscal conservative, and that has shaped a lot of your contributions to the political process and your time in D.C. What does that mean? And can you tell us why that matters to you so much?
I mean, it was kind of why I ran for Congress. So I definitely identify myself as that. But any member of Congress that is currently running a part of running a $1.5 trillion deficit, we all aren't doing a very good job at being fiscally conservative. But there's a strong desire to do so. So when I ran for Congress, I kind of highlighted three major things that I tried to bucket it up into three things. One was to support Hill Air Force Base. It's a huge part of my district. It's strong with our national defense. It's a great program. It's key to the community. Two was, I would always say, be a part of reversing debt culture. The third was to be a more positive, optimistic, conservative voice for the next generation. I think we don't get enough of that, and younger Americans are kind of looking towards, like, they want to find something, and I think they're looking for leadership, and so I wanted to sort of be that. But that number two piece, reversing the debt culture, is what I want to accomplish. I would love for my time in Congress for me to be able to say the debt to GDP ratio actually decreased. We leveled off. We were able to level it off, and we decreased it. Because if it's the trajectory that it's on now, I mean, it's in a really dangerous, uncharted territory. And so that's what it means to me, is to try to, be a leader back there to make this happen.
Yeah. And I know some of your colleagues in Capitol Hill are going to say, deficits really don't matter that much. We shouldn't be thinking of the federal budget in the same way that we think of a household budget. Where are they wrong on that?
Well, the reason they say that is because, we can print / borrow money. We have that ability with the Treasury to be able to do that. We're the world's reserve currency status. That provides a lot of benefit and advantage for us. And so we're overly relying on that condition, not recognizing that what we're doing jeopardizes that condition. If you have a benefit, something that is an advantage to you, and you don't take care of it, then you lose it.
Right.
And the history of the world will tell that superpowers, run their course. And we're still experiencing the strongest global economy. That's the positive side of it. Our economy is still strong, so we can carry on a bigger liabilities in our budget, in our balance sheet. But if we continue down this trajectory, those things are gonna come into question.
Right.
And if we don't have that security, then with running $1.5 trillion deficit, with $32 trillion in debt, a debt to GDP ratio well over 100%, whether you talk gross debt or public debt, we're basically over 100% on both of them. We're in uncharted territory, and it's a massive concern. And I urge my colleagues not to buy into the concept of modern monetary theory that just says because you can print money, we can continue to do this. It becomes a pyramid scheme at that point.
So not all of our listeners have the opportunity to nerd out on this stuff like you and I do. So modern monetary theory, basically just a competing idea that says we can spend and spend and spend, and there's no consequences for us spending beyond what is our capacity. It would be like if a household just decided there's no reason I can't run up a credit card debt.
We have not balanced our budget since the late 90s. And we've still had one of the strongest economies in the world. So that thought of they don't matter, deficits don't matter, has taken root in a lot of people's minds. And my point is they haven't mattered yet. Right. Now there's a lot of run on inflation that happens from deficit spending, but sometimes we've run big deficits and haven't had major inflation. So
that's right.
That isn't the argument that wins people's hearts and minds either. The argument needs to be that in a few years, that the money that we pay just to service our debt, the interest, from carrying a large debt, the money that we service it with could potentially be larger than our defense budget. And it will be our largest budget item in 20 or 30 years. To think about that goes towards nothing. That doesn't go towards a road. That doesn't go towards an F-35. That doesn't go towards an educational system. That goes towards just paying interest on our debt. And when has that never Any budget, any household, it topples over, whether you can print money or not.
Right. The cost of borrowing from our future, from our children's future. So I think that budget issues can kind of get lost on some voters. Like I said, not everybody has the luxury of sitting around and nerding out on these issues. Where does this connect with the everyday person who's a voter who maybe is thinking like, this isn't an issue that has always resonated with me? Where does this, where does it meet the everyday life of Americans? I mean, what are the programs that potentially have consequences coming from us not reining in spending and spending beyond our means?
I would say the first order of how it interacts with the American citizen is that they know that debt is bad. Mm-hmm. We've been taught it since you were in your first financial literacy course in 6th grade, middle school. Mm-hmm. We know that it's bad. We know that you've seen a friend or a relative or a neighbor have to, sell their home because they overextended themselves. The consequences are so much worse at the micro level, and we're not being responsible at the macro level to showcase that. So just the inconsistency between it. So then it also creates a little bit of behavioral change where people are okay getting on their credit cards. Like, everybody, this is kind of what we're doing. Everybody's fine with just, adding more debt, overextending ourselves. So it's the behavioral side of it that's bad. But our inability soon to invest in things that improve people's lives, like what I just talked about. I mean, what our government should be focused on is defense and roads. Like, if you want to boil it down, infrastructure, making sure that we're safe, making sure that we have a food supply chains that exist, like, and a strong national defense. Like, the more that we overextend ourselves, the less of the share of money we can put towards those tangible things. Right. And we're just putting towards, the interest, like I said.
Yeah. And some Americans may feel like they are, in fact, isolated from a lot of these spending issues if they're not someone who relies too heavily on social safety nets or programs. But a lot of Americans anticipate using Social Security or Medicare when they get older. Where are those programs headed, being some of the largest line items in the budget?
That is the exact point to make, because everybody's paying in through their FICA, through their payroll taxes, into Social Security, and you're going to draw on that at some point. It's a system that was created almost 100 years ago, and almost to the 100-year mark. I find this fascinating. In 2033, as it's predicted now, that the trust fund that services Social Security goes insolvent. It's depleting, and it finally gets to that point of going insolvent with all the projections.
Right.
That day, as soon as that happens, every Social Security beneficiary starts receiving 75%, a full 25% cut into their benefit. Anytime you cut 25% from any budget, like, we're not all living off of 25% just like savings and everything. That's a massive change to our retirement class, and it'll automatically happen if we as members of Congress don't figure out how to get out ahead of this issue. Right. So yeah. Not everybody is on Medicaid. Not everybody's on a welfare program. We could talk about those. There's lots to do in those programs that it should be done to strengthen those, to make those, to actually serve the folks that need them, and actually create opportunities to get out of poverty. Mm-hmm. But everybody's staring down the barrel of these two big programs that are the number one and the number two budget line item in our entire budget, is Medicaid, or is Social Security and Medicare, and these programs, the finances aren't going in the right direction. Part A is scheduled to run out within the next 10 years, Part A of Medicare and the Social Security Trust Fund. So that will definitely impact everybody, because we're, and if we're running $1.5 trillion deficit, we're not going to be able to just make up what we've lost in the trust funds. Right. Simply because we're just going to create more spending, and that's not the way these things work legally. So we've got a major problem we have to make whole with these programs. We have to be willing to address and say, hey, look, these are established. And when Social Security was established, it was largely because men were 60 at that age. They were passing away. They'd worked, and their spouses had nothing. This was an anti-poverty, like, let's go in and help out these surviving spouses for the few years that they're expected to live as well. Our age of, our life expectancy was much lower then. That program had upwards to 45 workers to one beneficiary. Over the course of the last 90 years, that has shrunk considerably. So we have only a handful of workers to each beneficiary. And those numbers just don't work out anymore.
It seems like this idea of deficits and, some sort of like boogeyman on the horizon that no one quite understands are starting to come to be more tangible. I mean, we talked about the idea that inflation is a potential consequence of spending beyond our means. And here we are in a place where Americans are going out and they see how expensive it is to buy groceries. And we hear about it on the news every day. And these programs that affect most Americans now in their retirement years are really on the verge of taking like a very practical hit, one that's like very obvious to the people who will be facing those consequences. Do you think that people are paying more attention to this issue today than they have been?
If our polling is right, and I like to poll my constituents, we do lots of outreach to folks in the 1st District of Utah, and I think it's pretty clear that debt, deficits, inflation always pinged at the very top of anything. And whatever's going on, you see, in our cable news world, both the right and the left, you see a lot of cultural battles. You hear a lot of criticism of individuals. Those stuff bother people. But when you put it down on paper, like, what is your main concern? And particularly in Utah, like a growing debt and an inability for the finances to actually work out because things are costing so much more, clearly reigns at the top of our feedback that we're getting from people.
So as we move into another federal election cycle, what is it that voters should be looking for from their lawmakers? If this is an issue that's important to them, what kind of questions should they be asking? What sort of action should they be asking for or looking for in someone's track record?
Yeah, I love that. And I was grateful to be able to spend time with the Sutherland Institute yesterday on, at the Weber State. And I made a comment that said, the narratives that are going to exist in the next presidential cycle are not what we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on energy and tax policy. Tax Cut and Jobs Act created some strong economic stimulus. It still created debt. We need to get our tax policy dead on. And I have a conservative approach to taxes that if you keep taxes reasonable and low and competitive, then you actually grow revenue. So I know the direction I want to go, and we need to make sure that the American conversation for this next presidential election is about energy and tax policy. Those are things that are truly affecting every American's lives, and all the distractional things that are bad. And I'm not, casting. I mean, I can criticize. It's the beautiful part about what I've done in politics. I probably made a mistake by making at least everybody mad at me at some point.
That means you're doing a
I
good
can
job,
look
right?
at I can look at what President Trump did leading up to January 6th and say we should not be trying to influence states, individuals from state legislators to influence and provide their own electors. Like that influence is wrong. I fundamentally disagreed with all that approach leading up to January 6th. You can take a legal approach to it, but there was other tactics and influence and everything involved. President Biden, from 2014, from what he and his family have done, to the extent that he received the money versus several other of his random family members, from a granddaughter to a brother, taking money from shell companies that were set up to take money from malign actors. Like, that stuff is all wrong, and it's going to dominate the narrative. But what Americans need to recognize is our tax and our energy policy need to be spot on to lead the next generation and for American economy to win. That's what we need to be focused on. So that's kind of what I think everybody should be paying attention to if you're looking at a candidate, whether you're a congressional lawmaker, state lawmaker, governor, whatever it is. We need to make sure that we're thinking about what are the things that actually affect Americans' everyday lives. And to me, it's energy and tax policy.
I agree that the national discourse is not always about the things that are most important. And there's an example.
That's what they get attention for.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's an example of that within the budget discussion that I want to talk more with you about. And let's do that right after we take another break.
Excellent.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Beth Akers, and you're listening to our segment on defending enterprise. Today I have with me Congressman Blake Moore. I want to jump right back in. We were talking before the break about things that get a lot of attention, but maybe aren't actually that important.
Productive.
Or productive. Now I'm leading here. I want to talk about the debt ceiling. And so again, not all listeners are super engaged on this issue, understandably, but we kind of forced them to be engaged on the idea of the debt ceiling because it was front page news for a long time, made a lot of noise, and I'm not sure what ultimately happened made a lot of difference. Can you tell us what happened there? First, what is the debt ceiling for people who don't follow this issue closely? What does it mean and what the heck happened?
So you just highlighted it perfectly. Big hubbub. It comes up every year to 18 months to 2 years. That's when people know about it, and then it's gone from their psyche. They don't really know what it is. Ultimately, the debt ceiling, the most productive aspect of the debt ceiling is it at least creates a moment in time that we can make some change. And that's what I thought that Speaker McCarthy did a really good job this time around, saying, look, we want something to change here. We want to use this moment. I don't think we should have a debt ceiling. A debt ceiling is kind of an arbitrary number. Mm-hmm. We should be tying our annual fiscal budgeting to a debt to GDP marker. We should set these indicators and say, hey, here's what we're going to try to get our debt to GDP to. We need to reduce this by 2%. And that's what we think we can accomplish this year while keeping our economy strong. So like across the board, debt ceiling is not a productive indicator.
Yeah. Well, let me slow you down a little bit because I think it's really important that listeners get this point. So debt ceiling, I like to say it's kind of like the limit on your credit card. Right? So this is kind of an arbitrary number that says American Express says you can spend $5,000 on your credit card, Beth. And, after that, we'll block your spending and you'll have to, not be able to make payments on the things that you already committed to pay for. It's kind of a fair analogy here, right?
1,000%. And American Express isn't even taking into consideration all of your potential income, maybe your family income, what your situation is, what you have coming up ahead. So it's just it's a number that's set, and Congress kind of sets it, and then we have to go through this process all over again. But you have to pay your debts. You have to pay the things that your bonded indebtedness. Mm-hmm. If you don't do that, then we have what we've never gone into, but could be extremely tumultuous and catastrophic in a default. And so the concept of the debt ceiling right now is, okay, we've done this, we've committed ourselves to this, and now we need to raise this so we can keep paying the things that we've already committed to. Right. And there's obviously always the arguments on whether we're spending too much, whether we tax enough, whether we have enough revenue. Like those are all the arguments we should be having, instead of, are we going to get through this debt ceiling situation? But for me, it was a great opportunity. We were able to, successfully negotiate a reduction in spending, and that hasn't happened for decades, right? So this was a good thing to ultimately take place. We didn't get everything we wanted out of it from our side. But we live in a reality that there's a president, a Democrat in the White House that loves to spend. The American Rescue Plan spent $1.9 trillion with no offset spending. It was all offset spending. It was inflationary at the worst. So we were able to kind of constrain some of that and get that back into. But when you say not much changed, like the amount of savings that we're going to do don't even make up for what additional interest that we're going to have to pay, and that is an automatic payment that we have to make. Right. And so we continue to go down, a higher budget line items each year, just because of our interest in what it ultimately
So
does
we're sort of in this standoff position, and Republicans had the power in that moment and effectively were saying, we want some cuts. It's important to us that we're not spending beyond our means. And this is a moment we're going to demand it. Even though the debt ceiling process is somewhat separate from how you really decide how much is spent.
We just put a marker down with the debt ceiling. We said, this is what we want to get to, and let's everybody agree to that. And then to actually go through the process is what we're going to be doing the next few months.
Yeah.
And that is going to be, I'll need to come on and do a whole nother podcast about what's going to go on during this, because this is where the sausage is made.
Right.
This is where we actually set our budget numbers and try to pass those. There's 12 appropriations bills, and that's what actually dictates the amount of money that our government will spend on the discretionary side.
Good. So let's talk a little bit about that. Because, I mean, I know that it kind of irritates voters when policy happens through these moments where we're kind of stuck in standoff and everybody's yelling and screaming. But how should we be deciding, how to spend in this country? What is the budget process? I mean, households, sit down and make decisions about how much they have coming in. Should they go get a job that makes more money? Should they cut their expenses? What is that process for Congress, and what's broken there?
So the biggest piece that's broken is the vast majority of the money we spend in Congress isn't even voted on each year.
Okay.
So as you put it into a family situation, that would be what we do in Congress right now would be basically taking 20% of your entire spend and saying, oh, let's talk about this. Well, you have 75, 80% of all that you're spending is going on automatically. And we're not going to address that. We're not going to actually vote on that.
Right.
We're only going to vote on this small percentage.
So you're playing on the margins.
There is what's called mandatory or direct spending, and there's called discretionary spending. And the discretionary spending is what we vote on each year. Those are the 12 appropriations bills. That is only 1.5 trillion of a $6 trillion budget.
Yeah.
So for people to grasp that, it's like, wait, I thought if we shut the government down, we're actually going to, stop a lot of this spending. No, it's actually a tiny portion of a small portion of the entire budget.
So it's sort of like a household saying like, hey, look, we're in trouble here. We got to make some serious decisions. Now we could, end our Hulu subscription.
Just going to bring up Hulu.
But we're not going to consider moving,
I actually
right?
look at it like, let's take a huge corporation.
Okay.
You have big expenses. You have labor costs. You have R&D. You have leasing that you're leasing. Coming up this fall, we're going to be dealing mostly, it's the office supply budget. It's your paper clips. I don't even want to sound like I'm diminishing it, but, we're trying to knock out about $130 billion, and I hope we're successful at being able to carve out 100 and getting this back closer to the FY22 levels, getting to 1.47 trillion instead of 1.6517 trillion. So if we can carve out some money there, we're definitely putting our discretionary spending on a better trajectory. And I'm all for fighting every wasteful dollar and finding it, cutting it, doing all that. We have to cut.
So how do we get those bigger line items back on the table for debate? I mean, what's the political process that's not allowing that, and how can that change? Should it change?
So what we can't have happen is what likely might is that when Social Security Trust Fund is running insolvent in 10 years, that we deal with it in 9.5 years. The debt ceiling only gets dealt with, a month or so before, and it's haggling back and forth and a lot of drama. And that's what we have to avoid. We have to go and look at these programs that are huge: Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and we have to be willing to go and say, hey, how can we make these more productive? What can we do in our Medicaid budget that will get people healthier and cost less? Well, better education and preventative medicine. All right, we're spending so much on catastrophic healthcare. We should be spending, probably doesn't have to be more, but we need to be focusing more on making sure that people get out ahead of some of these major issues. And diabetes, this is preventable. If we're better educated and smarter as a society. So we have to be willing to do the hard things. It's hard because it's political. Yeah. And if I say the word Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, then a Democrat challenger can grab this soundbite that we're doing right now and use it in some political message to say, hey, this Republican wants to cut your Social Security. I never said that. I said, I want to make sure these programs exist, and I want to make sure that my kids can take advantage of these programs going forward, because as they set up now, it's not going that direction. So we just have to be adults in the room and actually try to solve these problems before they become catastrophic.
Right. And so essentially this means legislation,
Yeah.
right? Which we often aren't turning to legislation for solutions in recent years because of what really feels like gridlock in Washington, and raises the notion of bipartisanship. I mean, is bipartisanship the answer here? I mean, and is there any reason for hope that we could start seeing movement on bills that have support from both sides of the aisle?
A couple very specific things. So bipartisanship is not necessarily the answer, because bipartisanship, good policy is the answer, right? And hopefully good policy can drive some bipartisanship. There is a Senate filibuster, and every American knows this. Well, maybe not every American, but this is a fact. So anything that will not pass the Senate filibuster is a messaging bill.
Yeah.
And guess what we do in the House of Representatives? A lot of messaging bills.
That's right.
Pretty much almost not everything. Most things get passed that you don't even hear about. They don't even go through debate. They're so basic and simple. That's suspension bills. We do a lot of those. We get along. We work together in committee. We do all that kind of stuff. But there's a filibuster for a reason, and that is to force collaboration and long-term viability for a particular bill. What we're in this mode of right now, it happened in 2017, it happened in 2021. I would call it once in a generation legislating that happens a whole lot more frequently, because when you have the White House, House, and Senate, you can bypass the filibuster only on economic matters, like something that actually impacts the deficit. So it's kind of this rule that exists, and you can bypass it and get something done. And when it forces Republicans and Democrats, when they have that political opportunity, forces them to go big.
Yeah.
Right. And what we've seen is two different philosophies. I'm obviously more supportive of the conservative approach in 2017, even though there was deficits that were created, because they just feel like we can't do this stuff in a gridlocked system. We have to go big. And Democrats have had all these priorities that have existed for decades, and they had that moment in 2021 to go big. And what did they do? They did ARPA, American Rescue Plan. And what did ARPA do? In my opinion, it just created a lot of relief spending that created inflation like we haven't seen since the 70s. So bipartisanship exists. There's good relationships. I focus on making sure that I dialogue with people and being civil. I think the Orrin Hatch Foundation does a cool thing with civility and solutions. Like, we need that. But we can't just rely on, we get the White House, House, and Senate as our only chance to do anything major. We've got to find a way to get things done. There's the must-pass bills. Like, there's a handful of must-pass bills. We find a way to compromise and stuff there. But then, like, other things we just keep kicking down the road and until there becomes brinkmanship. And brinkmanship doesn't create the right factors to really get good policy out of it.
Right. And it kind of irritates us voters too.
As it should.
So let's come back to the voters briefly here and say, imagine you're somebody who thinks this is important. You've got friends who maybe are not informed on it, or maybe kind of land in the middle. What are the kind of things you use to convince them that, like spending within our means, not running huge budget deficits, and that, getting control of this issue is really important? Like, what are like the, on the street kind of things that can inspire people to care about this issue?
Well, here's an example. 3 friends, neighbors that I have had long-term relationships with, some I just met because I just moved a couple months ago. They've all come to me with, hey, what's going to happen with the R&D tax credit? The things that we actually do in committee, I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, and I wanted to be on the Ways and Means Committee because all the things that we've talked about that are really driving our debt. I'm not going to dismiss the discretionary budget that we're going to do this fall. It's important. It's very important work. We need to find savings out of it. But if we save $100 billion out of, again, a $6 trillion budget, that's a positive. But year over year, if our interest increases that we're paying just to pay down just to service the debt, increases by $150 to $200 billion, it's like, this is my point. We're spending so much money on interest. We can't spend the money on things that matter. One of the biggest frustrations with my constituents in the last year and a half has been the fact that they can't get a passport because the State Department is so behind.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the State Department's budget is in that discretionary piece. I'm not saying they deserve more money. I think we just need to work harder and smarter and better. But like, that's a real frustration to people. And we're going to try to save and cut as much money from the discretionary budget, all while the amount that we're paying in interest is actually twice as much that we're going to have to pay next year. So interest will eventually take over our ability to invest in things that affect people's everyday lives. This R&D tax credit, though, the work that we do in Ways and Means, I wanted to be on this committee because it actually goes after the majority of our debt drivers, healthcare, right? How we raise revenue, and trade policy is key. And the welfare programs and things like that. That's majority where and Social Security. I'm on the Social Security subcommittee. Those are where our major spending and debt drivers are. I'm focused heavily on defense. Defense has not been something that's driven our debt. 50 years ago, it was 44% of our budget. Today, it's 13%. But these constituents, these neighbors, they're like, what is going on with the R&D tax credit? We're in a position now where they're not going to be able to write off their R&D because of the way that these bills were structured long term, and this is going to affect them quite a bit. And it hasn't really set in, but this is going to affect pretty much every company out there because all industries do R&D. So just highlighting to people, folks that really shouldn't have to be bothered with all this stuff, like, guys, come on, figure it out. I'm trying to go back there and work with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to say, like, this affects every one of our folks. Like, we have to get this figured out.
Right.
So,
you will pay for this in one way or another.
There's so many factors that affect them, but just kind of identifying those things that it does. And they're starting to recognize it, and it's concerning to lots of people.
Yeah, and I think that's the right thing to be happening. So thank you so much for being with us. I think we'll end the conversation there, but we appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and you've just heard an excellent conversation between Beth Akers and Congressman Blake Moore. Before we close out the episode, Beth, I want to talk a little bit about some key takeaways for our listeners, things that they can use in some of their conversations about this issue, and maybe first ask you, and you and the Congressman got into it a little bit toward the end of your discussion there, but how can these ideas of reining in spending and the proper way to do that, how would you then go to our listeners and go to voters and say, here's what you can do to defend this idea of fiscal prudence, really, fiscal responsibility? And if you're in a conversation with somebody who maybe needs a little bit of convincing.
Right. I really think it's helpful to think about the federal spending just like spending within a household. And we all appreciate that if we spend to excess in one year, maybe next year we're going to pay the price, right? Whether that means you need to pay back a credit card debt or move to a smaller home, or, there are consequences to our spending. And, the Congressman pointed out a few ways in which we're seeing real implications of this spending. The constraints on the Social Security and Medicaid mean that those programs may be facing real cuts in the future. Those are going to come back to affect people in ways that are much more tangible than I think this issue has affected them before. Economists often have these buzzwords that they repeat too often, and one of them is trade-offs. And I think it really is helpful here because while the notion of federal budget and deficit kind of feels like out of reach for some people, I think that the idea that real trade-offs are involved in these decisions is something that everybody can wrap their head around. And just the idea that if we spend more today than we have, we're going to pay for that in one way or another, whether it be higher interest rates, having to give up spending in the future, higher taxes. So there are real consequences. And we need to think carefully about whether what we're getting for our spending is worth what we need to give up.
I wonder if a good message to our listeners that they can then carry forth in their conversations would be this. So in past jobs, I worked in local government and dealt with budgeting at that level. And one of the questions we would always ask is this a nice to have or a need to have in terms of government functions? And you can kind of categorize things in that way. Right. These are the core essential functions that our government, we really need them to perform. This other stuff would be very nice. It would be great to have, but it's not as essential as some of these other things. So do you think that one message could be the reason we should support fiscal responsibility is because if we keep on spending money on things that are really nice to have, that's going to make it harder to spend money on the need to have items, such as maybe some of the entitlement spending that people rely on. You've talked about with Congressman Moore about how interest payments will at some point eclipse what we're spending on defense. And so talk about those trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, we're not in a political space, as Congressman Moore pointed out, where we sit down ever and say, what are our need to haves and what are our nice to haves? Instead, we're in a position of making incremental policy changes, sort of reacting to whatever political emergency is on the horizon. We talked about the debt ceiling as being prompting some conversations recently. So I feel like that's a great framework for thinking about it in the big picture. In practice, though, I think we need to be a bit more nimble and think, as we consider, should we forgive college debt, for example? Are there better things that we could be spending on that money on? And so I think that's the frame that we're forced into just because of how politics works in this country.
Well, I think those are very helpful talking points for our listeners, that we're hopefully kind of training a group of fiscal champions that can help, encourage their elected officials to help get our federal spending back on track. So, Beth, thanks so much for your time with the Congressman and bringing us those insights today as part of your Defending Enterprise segment.
Of course, it was great to be here again.
Well, before we let you go, I want to remind you, if you like what you heard today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this conversation and previous episodes that you can use in your conversations with friends and family, and you can share on social media. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Google, Apple, Spotify, any of the major platforms, wherever you like to get your shows. You can also watch on YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's all for this week's episode. Thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.